Well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for some, maybe, depending on your time zone, if you're over in Europe or not. But my name is Jennifer Joyce, and I'm the Regional Vice President of Sales for the Western region here at Condusiv Technologies, talking to you about how we can achieve a 2x faster SQL experience for you. So this webinar is really broken out into two parts. I'll just start with a couple of kind of high-level intros about the webinar, and then introduce my partner in crime that's on the line here. The first part is really going to be the thought leadership portion of this webinar. And what we're going to do is just dig in under the hood a little bit, under the technology stack, to really kind of try to explain some of the I/O inefficiencies that are occurring, some of the I/O degradation issues that happen in environments, especially when you're running SQL, particularly if you virtualize that environment, and what's happening under the hood that's stealing the underlying IOPS and performance that you're expecting to get, especially if you've already upgraded all your hardware and you've got the latest kind of, storage and all flash HCI, and you're still scratching your head on it. Really the storage subsystems just really having to work a lot harder than it should, and we'll undercover why on that. So some of the inherent I/O penalties that we're going to be bringing to light will be both within the Windows stack, and then once it flows down the stream down to the virtualization layer. So obviously, the compelling event here is how can you get more performance out of the investments you've already made and the infrastructure you have without having to do expensive forklift upgrades or adding more shelves into your storage substructure. And to help me cover this topic today, I'd like to introduce Howard Butler. He is the Senior Director of Systems Engineering. And for any of you car aficionados out there, if you're ever on a one-on-one call with Howard, chat him up on cars. Not only does he specialize in accelerating performance in computers, but he's also a race car instructor. So, Howard?
Well, Jennifer, thanks very much. Always a pleasure to join you here on the webinar. And although I drive fast, don't let Jennifer fool you guys. She's quite technical too. So feel free to pepper us with lots of questions throughout the webinar, and we'll do our very best to answer and address those.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Howard, and I'm glad to have you here with us today. And one housekeeping item is for everyone on the call, we do keep this really interactive, and we actually try to take questions and do Q&A throughout the call in addition to the Q&A session at the bottom of the hour. Sometimes we have to move it along so we finish by the bottom of the hour, so those of you who only allotted 30 minutes can go ahead and take off, and we'll stay on and answer Q&A for as long as it takes, as long as there's questions. So as the questions are popping up, please drop those into the public Q&A box rather than the private box to make sure we see them. And chances are, if you're thinking the question, at least 3 or 4 or 5 other people in the call are thinking the question as well. So don't be shy. Please put those in there. It makes the call a lot more interesting when we have that interaction. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in here. And I think the first thing, that I don't like to belabor the kind of the obligatory company marketing slide by any means, but I think it's worth spending about 30 seconds on this here just so you know who you're talking with today and where we come from. Because some of you may be going, Condusiv Technologies, why in the world do these guys think they have any thought leadership to even be talking about this topic today? So just a quick little history about us for what our street cred is. We're actually a 35-year-old software company, and from what we can tell, we're the 12th oldest software company in the world still in existence. So you translate that to software years. Is that a thing, Howard?
That is correct.
So we originally started the company known as DiskKeeper. Most of you probably have heard of DiskKeeper at some time. In fact, probably even used the software in the past for hard disk drives. But about 5-6 years ago, the company brought some very revolutionary intellectual property to the marketplace. It's actually got nothing to do with fragmentation, and it's come up off of the disk layer into the OS. And what we're about today now is reducing the noisy I/O, just kind of all that small, noisy, repetitive, unnecessary I/O. And as it turns out, on any given SQL system, that accounts for about 30 to 40% of all the I/O traffic, and it's just pure background noise, and it actually can be gotten rid of, just stealing IOPS and stealing throughput. And in fact, as people start digging into what our technology does, just a little bit of memory adjustment on the server side tends to get them up into a higher range of maybe a 50% offload of I/O. Now, for this work, we've also been named Cool Vendor by Gartner. They quite frankly didn't know what to do with us because we're so unique. Nobody does what we do. There were no quadrants to put us into. We stood alone in our own class, so they named us Cool Vendor when we launched this product into the marketplace. And now we've had it in the marketplace for going over a little over 5 years now. And we've got at least 2,500 mid-market to large enterprise customers using various iterations of our software. We've also got an OEM relationship, and as you can see kind of the list of names on the slide here of who's OEMing our software, the Samsungs and Dells and SanDisks of the world. So if you haven't heard of us, clearly you've heard of them. Millions and millions of copies of our software out there. And also our relationship with Microsoft goes way back, gold partner there and a VMware TAP partner. So you can see we've got quite a bit going on here. And Howard, just recently, I know that you were closely involved with this initiative a couple months ago, but Microsoft, I believe they named us as the first ever software vendor certified for their SQL I/O reliability program, right?
You know, you're right, Jennifer. And I really, truly consider this a very elite certification. I mean, when you think about it, you know, Microsoft has certain levels to make sure that other applications like ourselves are going to be fully compatible with their software offering, their platforms, and so forth, and in this case, SQL Server. And as you said, we're the only software vendor in there. But we're in pretty good company with the people like EMC, Dell, HP, and so forth. And, you know, besides all the testing, we also had to go through a fairly rigorous set of Q&A sessions with SQL experts, kind of like a panelist being interrogated there. And to get past this was no easy feat. And so I really do consider this a rather significant accomplishment on our part, Jennifer.
Well, thanks for the background on that, Howard. And actually, I'm going to jump into the Q&A box because as you were answering and expanding on that, I did notice that Rodney's asked a question, and I want to touch on this now since we're here. He asked, what are examples of OEM use? And Howard, this is another area that I know that you've been closely involved with our DRAM read caching technology, which we'll go into that technology a little bit later, but maybe you could just speak briefly to a couple of those OEM partnerships that I know you were involved with.
Well, you know, many of those partnerships involved one of the core technologies that we developed to assist in speeding up the I/O request to satisfy read I/Os from memory. And that's a core technology that we created that's embedded in many of the laptops and high-end workstations being offered by these manufacturers. And in some cases, even the storage manufacturers such as SanDisk and Western Digital got into the play there. And that technology is now been rolled into our commercial product offering. And we'll be speaking about the specifics of the technology a little bit later on in this webinar.
Great. Thank you for the background, Howard. So we're going to go ahead and jump on here, and I want to touch on this real briefly, just kind of setting the table here on, you know, the environment. We've been conducting a survey every year for the last 3 years, and about 1,000 people respond, and most of them respond to most questions. And this particular question, I think, really highlights a lot, and that really comes into the space of what application are you're really kind of struggling with the most, and SQL really. It got a lot of responses, and every year it's around the same, 27% last year, 28% this year on people having some sort of an issue with SQL sluggishness, and that's a lot. So if you're on this webinar, chances are you're in the 1 in 4 kind of companies that are having issues with some SQL performance. At least you're aware of it. Others may be having it and not aware of it. So that's really kind of interesting. And to this point, Nan Boone asks, does this benefit only SQL traffic or all server traffic? And the answer is this benefits all server traffic. One of the things that I'll highlight here is that our software offerings, and we'll get into this in a little bit more, are Windows focused. If it's a Windows server, there's going to be degradation and performance issues, and we'll touch on that a little bit more. But yes, this does go to all Windows servers. not just SQL, but SQL is a sweet spot based on the survey results that you can see right here. And SQL keeps rising to the top. So when we asked people to name the applications, you can see them here in the word cloud. SQL had the most frequency. The larger the font, the more often it was mentioned. So really kind of that database, BI, SQL, ERP, CRM type experience is where this is really coming up. So we want to talk a little bit now and get into exactly what's causing this issue. So before we go into the source of the problem, we really want to take a look and see exactly at more what the ideal situation is. What would be the best that we could get? So as you can see here on the screen, this is a really rudimentary extraction, obviously, of your I/O profile, but I think that the takeaway is pretty obvious and immediate. You can see that you can get, if you can get nice, large, clean, contiguous writes and reads, you can see that you're getting a healthy payload of data for every I/O operation. This is really what we want it to look like. We want it to be sequential. This would be an optimal relationship of data to I/O, and get the most and optimal I/O performance from your underlying flash hybrid or disk storage. But the moment that you take that SQL server, if it's physical, you may still be having problems with it. You haven't been able to virtualize it because of those issues. That you're just going to sacrifice too much performance by going P to V, and you're still maintaining this expensive hardware, not able to take advantage of the cost efficiencies of virtualization. Or if it has virtualized, maybe that performance is degraded, and you're kind of scratching your head into why, because you've got the biggest, bestest, baddest hardware out there, and you've upgraded to 10 gig and all of this stuff, and it's just still not happening. So this could be what we want the I/O profile to look like, but what it tends to look like when Windows is left to its own devices is like this. And by taking a quick look from what you saw before in the last slide to what you're seeing here, I think that you can take the immediate takeaway here that suddenly now in this environment, there's I/O characteristics that are much smaller and more fractured and more random than they need to be. And this is what we like to call, we refer to this as death by 1,000 cuts. Where your underlying architecture is processing workloads, but ultimately having to work much, much harder than it really needs to. And this is, I don't know, I guess you could say this is akin to pouring molasses all over your flash storage and hybrid storage, or your disk storage, because now you're really penalizing storage performance with what we call the perfect trifecta for bad storage performance: the small, fractured, random I/O characteristics. And if we dig into the hood just a little bit more to see what's actually going on and causing this, there's really two different things. I would just refer to them as I/O penalties or I/O taxes that are occurring. They're penalizing your performance and causing the I/O characteristics to break down or degrade. Now, the first one is the I/O blender effect, and that's kind of at the bottom of the slide there. And it's likely that you've heard that phrase or that term over the last few years. It's a term that we actually helped Gartner coin about 5 years ago when virtualization was really gaining momentum across the landscape. And the I/O blender effect is what happens the moment that you virtualize more than one server and you get multiple servers on the same host hypervisor. And then you've got multiple hypervisors attached to the same SAN. So, on a physical server environment, you've got a one-to-one relationship between the server and the underlying storage. And even though you still have small split traffic, you don't have it all blending together and getting randomized like that. So the moment that you add another server to that host and another server and another server, there's really no fix for what happens. And as great as virtualization is for server efficiency, one of the biggest downsides is that it does add complexity to the data path. And what happens is that the host hypervisor now mixes and randomizes otherwise sequential I/O streams and now delivers to storage a much more randomized pattern. And the moment that you add, that third VM, that fourth VM, guess what you're doing? All you're doing is just amplifying the effects of randomization even further. I was on the phone with somebody about a month ago that was saying as soon as he's an MSP, and he said as soon as he adds that 8th server, he can tell. And that 9th server, he's done. He's like, I can just see the performance drag, and he's obviously measuring his SLAs very, very closely, being in that hosting kind of business. So, and he's like, and we've already, upgraded everything. We're all flash. We've spent $100K on the latest SAN and this and that. And it was, just one thing after another. And he goes, as soon as we get to that tipping point, it's done. So V-locity came in to allow him to increase that density and push it up even more, saving him from having to buy more hosts to maintain that SLA. Now, when kind of shifting gears back here, most organizations, that degradation that comes over time with virtualization, most organizations don't realize it. It kind of has a slow creep. It's sort of like, you're driving in your car, turning the radio up a little bit more and a little bit more, a little bit more. You don't realize how really loud it is until you get in your car the next time and it blasts you out. Same thing happens with the slow creep of performance degradation. So most people have virtualized slowly over time. They've grown into that environment. Very few just flip the switch and go 100% overnight, which makes it really visible. But Howard, we actually had one of our larger customers do that. Christus Health, and they've got Christus Health is out of Texas, and they're one of the top 10 largest healthcare providers in the U.S., located out of Texas, as I mentioned, and they've got over 2,500 VMs with our software deployed. And Howard, they went overnight virtual, and I think that you were involved in that. Have some insight into that, don't you?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. They did their testing on individual systems, like many folks would do, and they were expecting that when they went physical to virtual, that they get the same performance. But when they virtualized all those systems, that's not what happened. What they got was a performance degradation. And part of their analysis when they went through to figure out why that was occurring, what they found is that it wasn't CPU related, that it wasn't memory constraints, it truly was I/O bottleneck issues. So, Jennifer, that's what was causing their issue. And naturally, their first reaction would be, hey, we're going to have to upgrade all of our storage, and we're going to go to an all-flash array to try to solve that type of bottleneck problem. But before they did that, they got a copy of our software, they installed it, and what they were able to see was that there was a tremendous reduction in I/O traffic that solved their bottleneck issues, Jennifer. So for them, rather than spending $2 million for an all-new flash storage array, we were able to save them that capital expense to where they could either pocket that money or do something else with it with another project. So that was the case of what happened with Christus there.
No, that's great. Thank you, Howard. And I do see some more questions starting to come in, so thank you for those. We'll keep moving through and get to those at the bottom, so please start dropping your questions in as we go. With the Christus story, we have a published case study with them on that. You can go to our website and check that out. But now, as difficult, as that penalty is, there is a worse penalty upstream, and at the very top of the stack, if you will, and that's that Windows I/O tax that you're looking at right there. There's some really severe inefficiencies in the handoff of data between the Windows operating system and the underlying storage, and there really are no APIs that connect the two, other than just using the rudimentary framework that Windows has always used by addressing the logical disk to write data. And Howard, this creates a real serious problem because the Windows operating system, for any given file that should be written and read with 1 or 2 IOs or 3, just a minimal number of operations, Windows ultimately takes that file and breaks it down to be much smaller than it actually needs to be. And ultimately what's happening is that you end up in a situation where you're processing 4 IOs or more, multiple IOs for a single file that really could or should be written just with 1 IO. So Howard, maybe you could just expand a little bit for us on what's actually happening here and why Windows is so inefficient with the data handoff.
Well, Jennifer, the Windows file system truly does kind of take a one-size-fits-all type of approach. When a file gets created or extended, the Windows file system truly doesn't know at that moment in time how big that file is going to be. So what it does is that on the logical side, the abstract view of the storage that Windows works with, it looks for the next fixed allocation in size, and if that file extension or the data that's being written is bigger than that, it'll write what it can and then go on to grab the next available free space, write what it can, queue up another I/O request, and grab the next available free space. So what happens is while your application may be issuing a single I/O request, Windows doesn't go looking for the best possible fit. It only grabs the next available free space. So what happens is one I/O request from the application may turn into many, many hundreds, many thousands of small, random type of I/O requests that are quite troublesome for the storage to deal with and takes extra time. So in what we're able to do is it would be much better and more efficient that if the system could deal with larger sequential IOs going to the storage system. And those are the things that will certainly help improve performance.
Thank you, Howard. And, as you've been talking, there's some really good questions coming into the Q&A box. All of these we will answer on the upcoming slides or during the Q&A session, so keep coming with those questions. Those are really good ones. And, and Howard, just to build a little bit on what you were saying, we had also recently published a case study with the University of Illinois, because what I want to kind of highlight here is that this is really still happening to folks no matter what type of hardware they've upgraded to. So they may still be sitting on all spinning disks, but a lot of people have tiered storage. They've got a lot of capacity in that tier 1 caching layer. A lot of people have gone all flash to great cost and great investment, and a lot of folks are starting to go HCI. And so, we had a recent one with University of Illinois, which is also a published case study on our website where, they had Oracle databases and SQL databases running in Windows. And they were already upgraded to the latest Dell. They had a Dell Compellent all-flash arrays in their environment, and they had done that for their hardest-hitting databases. And day one, everything was good. But a year later, performance had really degraded to the point where they were missing their SLAs, and they thought they were going to have to do a major costly upgrade and buy more flash arrays to get the IOPS. But before they did that, while they were looking for answers, they came across their software solution and realized, what's there to lose? It's a free trial. So they installed us and recovered the performance. And so it really kind of comes down to the fact that we're talking about a software problem. We're talking about a problem that's being generated by the software layer of the Windows OS, the operating system. And rather than solving it by throwing more hardware at it, this is a solution to solve it by a software solution, which makes a lot of sense. So if you look at the next slide here, I mentioned that both Howard and I would give you just a very quick overview of what our software does, and we'll jump into that right now. Then we'll talk with you about the handoff of the NFR that we're giving you so that we can, you can kick the tires in your own environment and see the benefits of velocity firsthand. But a couple of things to point out here is, first, this is set and forget it software. It installs right into the Windows operating system. You literally install it and you can walk away. It's a very thin filter driver, and it has nominal overhead. We call it near zero overhead, and we would challenge you to even see the CPU footprint that it's consuming. It's enormously lightweight, and the CPU resources it does use run at lowest priority, so it's never interfering with your server performance. And what the software is doing is actually offloading I/O from the underlying storage. And then at the same time, whatever I/O does remain, as Howard mentioned, we're streamlining that I/O traffic. So it's a friendly I/O profile for your storage to process. It's much quicker, and we do a couple of different things. We have 2 patented engines with the software that you should just be aware of what it's actually doing. And before I go into the first engine, I'll also mention that we have a 90-day money-back guarantee, but no one ever takes us up on that because they just use our free trial, and they've completely convinced themselves of the value of the software before they buy it. So we do have to try before you buy, but if you want to buy it up front, we won't stop you, but you do get a 90-day money-back guarantee because we're so confident about what the product does. So I'll jump into the first engine here. So the first engine that I want to talk about is IntelliWrite. And Howard, let's first start here on what we're doing to optimize these writes. We already talked about how Windows has this issue where Howard highlighted that we're not just looking for the next available allocation on the logical disk layer, whether it's the right size or not. So Windows just is a next fit write logic. Now, what we want to give Windows a little bit of credit in one sense is that when it's freshly formatted NTFS value, you're probably going to be getting ideal I/O performance from minute 1, and we've seen even throughout the day it starts degrading. But on the first day, it's always going to be the right size. You're going to get that nice sequential traffic. You're going to get the nice large contiguous writes. But as time goes on and files are written and erased, patches are applied and the unneeded parts are deleted, files are written, rewritten, extended, that's where the issue comes in, and you start getting the breakdown at the logical NTFS level, and it starts degrading the I/O profile. So one example, Howard, is like if you're trying to write a 64K file and the next available space is only 4K, it will fill that 4K, split it, find the next available allocation, fill it, split, rinse, and repeat until the full file is written. And Howard, we have this patented technology that can actually solve that problem and make sure that we're delivering every time the file with the optimal density, with the I/O with the optimal density. So maybe you might just share with us a little bit more about the kind of intelligence that we're adding here to enforce that type of optimization within the Windows operating system.
Yeah, great, Jennifer. Kind of as I mentioned before, the file system doesn't know how big that file creation or extension is going to be. So kind of as you said, it's going to be looking for the next allocation. Well, what we're doing is something quite simple. In the background, we're able to monitor the behavior of the system in your applications, and we're saying to ourselves, hey, if this file type or this application, when a file gets created or extended, we can see and know from the behavioral analytics and the monitoring that we're doing how big it's going to be. So we can feed that intelligence back to the Windows NTFS file system. So now the file system knows and can say to itself, here comes a file creation. And instead of grabbing the next available free space, it's now going to be aware of how big that allocation needs to be and where is the larger chunks of free space. So now the Windows file system is going to be processing and handing off large, nice sequential writes. So now it's very simple, just providing that type of intelligence to the file system so it can do a better job. But I kind of like to use this analogy because I realize not everybody is deeply involved with the Windows file system like I might be. But imagine this, guys. If you were wanting to carry a gallon of water from one place to another, visualize this in your mind. You could do that with 100 small individual Dixie cups and go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Or you could just do it with one big, giant gallon jug. And you could do the same amount of, transfer of information or of data all in one time. And that's what we're helping the file system to enforce. Nice sequential writes, which is many times more efficient and more optimum. So I think that kind of gives people a definite idea, Jennifer.
Thank you, Howard. So Howard, what I'm kind of taking away is the net takeaway here is that, this intelligence helps the Windows OS find the best allocation at the logical layers, since the next available is rarely, if ever, the right size. And, as powerful as that engine is, and as much as that engine alone helps customers, it's not the only thing that we're doing. And this branches us back over into the products we were talking earlier about, our OEM relationships with a lot of those big manufacturers. And this is really our DRAM read caching engine. Excuse me, I think I advanced too far. So we are on IntelliMemory slide. I might have messed up the slides earlier, but that's fine. We'll go on. So with our DRAM read caching engine, what we're doing is I mentioned earlier, at the storage layer, you typically will have either all flash or you've got a tier 1. Well, we're establishing a tier 0 caching strategy in your environment simply by leveraging the leftover idle available DRAM sitting there just on any given VM or physical server. And we'll talk about the unique question someone asked about SQL memory here in just a moment. But just in general, in your kind of everyday run-of-the-mill average server, you've got leftover memory sitting there that we're going to be able to utilize. Otherwise, it's going to waste. And we're going to use that leftover portion dynamically to serve hot reads. So the real genius of this engine is that it is completely automatic. As I just mentioned, it's dynamic. You don't have to carve out and again, we'll speak about SQL specifically in a moment, but you don't have to carve out or allocate any memory for cache with the software, because it's aware moment by moment of how much memory is unused at any given moment, and it's only using that portion to serve hot reads. So that way you're never having an issue with resource contention. If that memory gets called for by something else, we back out immediately and release it. We're checking every second to make sure that there's free memory for the operating system or other applications to be using. So you never have to worry about memory starvation because the intelligence of this engine is so dynamic. So now obviously, if you're at peak loads and your memory constraint and it's really kind of everything's taxing the system, we back off, like I mentioned. But if you are slightly over provisioned on memory and you've just got a couple gigs, 4 gigs, 6 gigs sitting there free and idle, we're going to be able to put that to good use and take advantage of the caching. So, we found that if customers can maintain around 4 gigs of free memory, that's kind of our starting point. If it's not there, we simply will sit on the sideline and not cache, so no harm, no foul. But it's not always about how much you have, because a lot of folks, when you start talking about caching, especially with SQL, because SQL tries to cache the whole database on its own, a lot of people will make the association that you need a lot of memory to be effective, and that's simply not the case. We can, with our efficiency and our selectiveness of what's in the cache, it's extremely efficient, and with very little space, we can go a long way. And we're really offloading a lot of traffic going down and back. And Howard, this is a really good moment for me to maybe turn this over to you for just expanding a little bit on this. We are at the bottom of the hour. We have run over. We apologize. So Howard, before I turn this over to you for a little bit more expansion on IntelliMemory, I just want to make a public announcement that the webinar is recorded. So if you have a hard stop, we will send you a recording you can pick up here. But we're going to stay on and wrap up the main portion of the webinar, and then we'll get to the Q&A session. So Howard, over to you for maybe a little bit more expansion on IntelliMemory.
All right. Well, there are 2 things that are rather unique about our IntelliMemory caching, and I think that's why 9 of the top 10 PC manufacturers license our technology. And perhaps, of course, you may not have heard of us because they do license our technology under their own brand names. But the 2 things, as you indicate, is dynamic usage, and we'll only use what's available, meaning free, unused memory that's not being used out there. So if a system or a user or a process needs or wants more memory, we're automatically going to give that memory back up and give it back to Windows, give it back to the application, so there's no memory contention. Now, the second part is wrapped around our intelligence of what to put and keep in the cache for the best benefit. Populating the cache with a bunch of one-off type of requests doesn't really do anybody much good. So we keep track of what data blocks are being accessed most frequently at any given moment in time, and that's what gets populated into our cache. And it stays in the cache for as long as that information is useful and being repetitively read and so forth. But as time marches forward, you do have situations where your workload changes. What was hot a few moments ago or a few hours ago that's in cache really is now no longer that important because applications are accessing other data, other files, and so forth. So we're constantly learning about the behavior of the environment and can make sure of what we put into cache is going to give you the best benefit. So what we can see that there are big performance gains that it can provide because memory-to-memory type of data transactions are many times faster than going to flash or SSD, and that offloads all of that read I/O traffic away from having to go to storage. So now it helps you have greater bandwidth or extra I/O capacity at the storage level to do other useful things. Does that kind of help clarify things a little bit, Jennifer?
Yeah, I appreciate you adding that extra color there, Howard. And I think that some of the highlights of what the product does. So we've talked about how it does it. Now let's talk about the benefits that we've seen it provide to customers. And, if any of you are a Gartner client, you can check in with them. But they have referred to us as the world leader in DRAM read caching. And we can't say that we are for sure, but we think we've sold more caching licenses than any other player in the marketplace over the years. And, a couple of these real-world cases here that I just want to highlight on. For example, we've got ASL Marketing. They had a huge import batch job that they would do. It had millions of records, and it would take 27 hours to complete. And they just didn't have it in the budget to rip and replace. In fact, this was an installation that I was involved with, and I got to see the before-after firsthand, and I asked them, hey, guys, this is phenomenal. You do a case study. So we have a case study published with them on this one. And so they had a 15-hour reduction on that workload. And you know, we see others. Christus Health, as we mentioned, was able to cancel a $2 million PO. I also kind of see this across the boards where just specific applications are addressed, specifically SQL. Bell Mobility had a SQL improvement with Myron Corporation in the left-hand corner there. Those were ART files. Again, that was the Myron and the Bell Mobility were deployments I got to be involved with as well, and I got to see those results and asked them both for case studies because it was just so great. So I kind of see the benefits range from addressing a specific isolated application that's having performance issues all the way to going enterprise-wide, saving millions and millions of dollars in hardware. And then I also see benefits on what I like to call the Windows shadow effect, like Creative Office Pavilion in the upper right-hand corner. They were more in the category of customer that has these glitchy, you know, deadlocks, freezes, hangs, remote users getting booted off of email, kind of ghost performance issues that, you know, the phones would light up, they'd go look for what the problem was. The problem was already cleared, they can't see what it was. You know, 30, 40, 50% of those types of issues just vanish when our software goes in because it's I/O related, but no one's able to detect that it's really I/O related and that the source is the inefficiency of the Windows operating system. So just some takeaways there. And some other things too, like another one that I did just recently actually is Agrium. SQL databases began to slow down, and we actually got a chance to meet with them in person just recently, and they said it made the difference of being able to virtualize the servers in the first place. And it's the first year that they haven't had significant downtimes during their peak season during the summer. They're a fertilizer company. So just a lot of really neat things that happen with the software. This is what the UI looks like, and you can see that this particular server is throwing off data for the last 3 weeks, and this is a typical result from a server that's got 4 gigs of free memory on it. And you can see the total I/O is eliminated, the read I/O is eliminated, the write I/O is eliminated, and the storage I/O time saved. There's some other screens and reports that go into more depth in the product, but this gives you a quick high-level introduction to what that looks like. So what we want to talk about right now is the best practices, the handoff of the free software, the best practices for giving you the experience with the software. And I'm going to talk about 3 levels of optimization real quick before I go into these types of things. This is kind of what I like to refer to as the 3 layers of optimization. And I think this is one of the most important things I could possibly cover on the webinar. And that is that when you're looking at optimizing an environment and you've got a specific problem that you're trying to solve, you can start with just the biggest I/O server, which is really what that NFR handoff is for, that free copy of the software that we're going to be giving to you. But what we have found is that because of virtualization and because of the complexity of architecture, multiple servers supporting an application, you may have the database server, the web server, the proxy server, some other types of things in the mix that data is all passing through. I like to take it down to the second level at a minimum, and that is deploying velocity to every VM that is touching the data path of that application's data. So if there's 3 VMs or 8 VMs or 30 VMs that are supporting that application, it could be going over to an ETL server, the file server, the database server, whatever that architecture is. We've found that sometimes it's not enough just to deploy to the main big I/O server because even though the other servers may not look like they're pushing a lot of data, it's like a relay race. And the analogy I like to use is handing off a baton. The data is the baton, and all of those servers are the runners. So even you may have a runner on the team that's only running 100 yards of a 2-mile race, but if that runner runs that 100 yards very slowly, the team is going to lose. And that's a lot of times what we're finding happening in these complex multi-tier architecture application support. So in that regards, we would encourage you to try our Velocity trialware, leveraging our administrator console, which is included and bundled into the product at no charge. And you would set up a VM just for the VMC, the Velocity Management Console, and use that to deploy to all the VMs in that cluster or supporting that application. And I'm going to say right now, we certainly will be following up with you in email after the webinar, but if anyone's already going, yeah, I want to try that, just drop into the Q&A chat box, VMC, Velocity Management Console. Just drop in VMC 30-day trial. We'll make sure that we get you that expanded one right after the webinar, so you can just get right out the gate and start. Then the third level that I like to talk about is actually enterprise-wide or all of the VMs on the same host or all of the VMs that are attached to the same backend storage. And that goes back to that I/O blender effect. And we have seen that happen as well. And I'll give you one quick anecdote, and then we'll move on. I just did a POC, and we're actually waiting for the PO to come in with a company that has, get this, they have 11 physical servers, no virtualization layer, attached to a pure SAN storage that pushes 600,000 IOPS. This is a very time-sensitive application, very, very tight SLAs need to be met for their customer base. And they were simply missing their SLAs even with all that hardware sitting there. They deployed to their data warehouse server, that level 1, just by itself, and we saw no change. We then went to actually level 2 and 3 in one shot because there was no host. We said, let's go ahead and deploy to all 11 physical servers attached to that backend SAN and see if the I/O blender effect of these multiple servers hitting that SAN is causing it. We did that, and we shaved 4 hours off of the workload for that data warehouse, the overnight job. Now, they also had an overnight job running on a separate SQL server. We shaved 15 minutes off. Both jobs are about 8 hours long. Mileage does vary, and it is going to depend on the application you're running, but we got there by eliminating the I/O blender effect in that level 3 universal deployment. And they asked us, how was that possible? They have 600,000 IOPS, and they're only using a small fraction of it. And the analogy I like to give for that is walking into a room. I'm going to give away my height here. I'm 5'3". And so as I walk into a room, and let's say the room has a maximum capacity of 200, and there's 202 people in the room. It's 20-foot ceilings. There's 15 feet of vertical space above me representing the 600,000 IOPS. I simply can't use that 15 feet of space above me. I'm not going to pole vault across the room, and I need to get from one side to the other, and it's crowded. So what we're looking at and focused on is the 5'3" space that we're using, the 5 to 6 feet of space that the rest of us are walking in around here, milling about, trying to navigate around each other. That's what we optimize. You could have all the capacity overhead, in the world to work with, but if you're not bursting into that, you're not using it. And really that is a hardware, like I mentioned earlier, that's throwing a hardware solution at a software problem. So what we're coming in, we're doing is we're saying, okay, would 30 to 40% of the people please leave the room? They just leave the room. They're not there anymore. And then the rest of the people, would you please stand in nice lines and get sequential? And now I can walk straight through the room. So not only is that traffic going to move easier, but the next traffic, myself walking into that room, is going to be able to move through very easily as well. So that's why we look at the 3 levels. You could start with your big server. Then you could go to all the VMs supporting that application and or on the host, and then you could go to all the VMs attached to the same LUN or storage backend. Hopefully that analogy added some flavor there of kind of a successful path and approach to looking at velocity to solve your toughest I/O problems. Regarding SQL specifically, as we can see back to the slide here, adding more DRAM if possible. Now, if you already have plenty of memory on that server, and especially if it's a physical server, you're sitting there with 256 gigs or something like that, great. You're probably not going to need to place any memory limits or add anything onto that server. If you're sitting with a server that's got 32 gigs or 64 gigs or even 16 gigs, you probably still already have enough on that server. But per one of the questions I saw in the Q&A box, you will want to place a memory limit on what SQL is allowed to use. And somewhere between 4 gigs to 16 gigs, we can certainly hop on a call with you to analyze and assess exactly how much on your individual servers. So again, just a reminder, if you want the Velocity Management Console, you want to be able to trial this on more servers broadly, just drop VMC into the chat box. But the other thing I'm going to mention is that we do have a free assessment tool called the Condusiv IO assessment tool. This is free. And it will allow you to do a sniff test on the server, one, to see how much free memory you have, total memory. You send that report back to us on your SQL servers. We'll be able to very quickly tell you and give you advice on memory limits that you'd want to set. So anybody who wants the IO assessment tool, go ahead and drop IOAT into the box. Stands for IO assessment tool, so just drop in IOAT into the box, and we'll make sure that you get the IO assessment tool as well. So VMC, IOAT, you can put both in the same chat, whatever, and we'll get those to you. And the IO assessment tool, just a quick note on that, nothing needs to be installed on your target servers, so it's agentless. You will install the IO assessment tool on one server, and then we use remote WMI calls to collect existing perfmon data from the servers that you're polling. So again, it's very non-intrusive. So again, IOAT and VMC, or all of the above. So the other thing then is I think we've covered that. And then what we want to do is once you've installed, then we'll schedule a quick 10, 15, 30-minute call. It'll be with myself, Howard, some of our peers, to just review the I/O assessment results, and or if you've already deployed Velocity, we can do a dashboard review with you and then make recommendations. Either you got the result you were looking for, or we can make recommendations for a Phase 2 Level 2 or a Phase 3 Level 3 evaluation experience. So what we're going to do is right after the webinar, we're going to go ahead and our marketing team will start sending out the NFRs. If you don't see it by end of day, check your spam filter. If you've noted in the chat box that you want to receive the I/O assessment tool or the Velocity Management Console, the sales team will be manually sending that to you, and then we'll also have one of our team members reach out to you to schedule a review call with us 7 days to 14 days after, especially with the holidays. We may be talking with you after the new year. So that is kind of wraps up the content portion. Again, if you have to hop off, we will be sending out a recording, but I'm going to hop into the Q&A box now and look for questions that we have not answered, because I know I saw some really good ones earlier. So the first, let me scroll up. Got a lot of people asking for the trial. That's just awesome, guys. All right. So Howard, I've got so many things scrolling in right now that I'm not seeing all the questions. Let me just see if I can scroll up. It wasn't letting me just a second ago. Okay, I've got it here. So we've already answered the first question from Rodney about OEM use. We now have from Dan Boone, I've answered that question. Does this benefit only SQL traffic or all server traffic? It does benefit all server traffic, as we've covered. Martin asks, where should the software be installed, on VM or physical server? And what is the block size you recommend, 64 or 4K? So I'll answer the first part and ask Howard to answer the second part. You will install this on both VMs and physical servers. You will not install it on a host. So if you have a Hyper-V host, even though that's Windows-based, you do not need to install it there. Obviously, VMware isn't Windows-based. We're not going to install anyway. So this is installed on each VM and on each physical server. And Howard, he's asking about block size recommendation for 64K versus 4K.
Well, certainly on the cluster size of the volume, we support all valid Windows cluster sizes. Makes no difference to us. It's really a function of what is best for your environment in terms of the average size of files. 64K can do larger data transfers, but if you're creating mostly tiny little files, then you may be over-allocating space and wasting a little bit of space if the files don't fill that full 64K. So it's really up to you, but we support both cluster sizes.
Thank you, Howard. Carol asks, if I run a Windows 2019 server with Hyper-V on it and 3 VMs running on it and 1 SQL running on one, if the VMs, what products would we run on that server? We run Diskkeeper on the main Windows 2019 server box. So this is a really good question. You would run either Velocity or Diskkeeper. And we didn't talk about Diskkeeper much on this webinar, other than to mention at the beginning of the company that it is one of our flagship publications and kind of a legacy. Diskkeeper having been a traditional defragmentation software, I will make just a comment here right now that the Diskkeeper 18 version, which was recently released, we actually gave it a major overhaul. All of the features of Velocity that we designed for virtual spaces, where we moved away from defragmentation, we moved to the proactive optimization and DRAM read caching, have been installed into Diskkeeper. So Diskkeeper 18 is now basically Velocity with the Diskkeeper logo. So you can literally run Diskkeeper or Velocity on any of your VMs, on any of your servers. We like a single pane of glass approach, so if you're already running Diskkeeper, you may just want to have Diskkeeper out of preference for just managing one platform, or you may want to just convert over to Velocity and run that way. So either one's good, and Diskkeeper now has that major overhaul upgrade of all of the Velocity technology has been brought over to it. Dan asks, my SQL app requires 32 gigs of RAM, which is what we have. Will this require more RAM? So if your SQL app requires 32 gigs and you don't want to take any away from it, then you would want to place a limit at 32 and then add more RAM to that VM or a physical server. If it's physical, you may be landlocked, but if it's a VM, yeah, if your manufacturer or public application publisher requires 32 gigs RAM, then place a limit and add a few more gigs. If you feel comfortable taking some away from it, then you could maybe put the limit at 24. Still have 32 on the system, but just leave 24 for SQL and the rest for the OS and for Velocity. So we could obviously give you a customized consultation on that. Jason asks, what about SQL? I need to scroll here. I can't see the whole question. Here we go. Jason asks, what about SQL, which consumes all available RAM? Do we have to put a limit on it or to allow memory for IntelliMemory? Yes, you may. If it is consuming all of the RAM, you would definitely want to put a limit on it. And again, the IO assessment tool can help us get a peek into that, and we can give you exact recommendations. Our recommendation is going to range between 4 gigs and 16 gigs. And Howard, we actually can use up to, what was it, 120 gigs? We can go to that big if we need to.
128 gigs of DRAM could be used for the caching.
Okay. And one thing I'm going to mention here too is that we always leave a certain amount free at all times. There's always going to be a reserve space that's never used. We will never take you to the limit. Do you cache writes? No, we do not. If so, is there any chance of data loss? Well, it's a moot point because we do not. Windows, maybe Howard, I'll just ask you to touch on that a little bit more.
Well, certainly the notion of being able to cache writes is something technically we could do in the future. But, you know, as it stands right now, we're caching only the reads to ensure data integrity and so forth, and not have to worry about writing how data gets written out to the storage device, although we do have technologies that could provide that capability in the future.
Great. Thank you, Howard. We're coming to the end of the questions. We have a couple left that I'm going to get to. So if you have any lingering questions you didn't ask, get them typed in right now because we will end off after we've answered the last question. But these have been really great and we appreciate the interaction. So Jason asks, can the console be disabled on the VM guest? Is there a central management point? So Howard, maybe you could just describe our velocity management console and also our ability to kind of turn on and turn off the software as needed.
Yeah, well, certainly you can turn on and off the software just by stopping the service. But there's, you know, a built-in user interface for each local install of the Velocity product, and that also ties back into communicating to the Velocity management console. So you do have that centralized, you know, management infrastructure for deployments, reports, license tracking, those type of functionality is all what's part and parcel of the Velocity Management Console.
Great, thank you. And Joseph asked a question that I believe we've already touched on, but I'll touch on it just to make sure. Do you have to have this product installed on both the host and the VM? No, just the VM only. And I'm scrolling down to see if there's more questions. Okay, here we go. A few more questions at the bottom here. Brian asks, he wants both. Great. I have a hosting environment with 8 hosts and over 100 virtual servers. I would very much like to talk to someone. Okay, great. We'll certainly do that, Brian. Licensing, I'll just touch on licensing briefly. We can license by either VM, physical server, standalone, you know, individual seat basically, or we can license by host. And when we license by host, it is all you can eat. So anything that's Windows 2008 R2 or higher, or Windows 7 for VDI environments or higher, gets the ability to have the software deployed to it when you license by host. So you have the all-you-can-eat model or the per seat kind of cherry pick a few servers out of your environment model, whether they're physical or virtual. And you also can, and I see another thing from Dan real quick, you know, asking for a VM trial on about 30 virtuals. Our trialware is unlimited. You can put it on all of your servers for this evaluation. So going to 30, or in Brian's case, if you want to try it on all 100, go for it. We will assist you with it as well and provide you with some engineering support. Pre-sale support at no cost, by the way. So Vince, just for clarity, when deploying on Hyper-V, do we need to install on both host and VMs? No, you will install on VM only. We have installed on the hosts, and at this point in time, Howard and I have done that multiple times just to see if there was a benefit, and the VHD files are not having enough performance degradation, and the read traffic is sensed by the VMs directly enough that the caching at the VM level has been sufficient. So the maximum benefit is by deploying it to the VMs. The other question that's maybe a little bit undercurrent that we didn't touch on in the webinar that may be tacitly asked in this is about resource management or resource contention. And I should have mentioned this in the webinar, but the reason you don't need to install in a central place is because we used to install on the host, and that was as kind of the brain of the octopus so that all of VMs wouldn't start fighting for resources. What we've done now instead is the VMs basically are self-aware in that it's very simple logic of how we do this. If the VM has a lengthening I/O response time, and it's heuristically going to know what the average is for that specific VM. But if that response time starts lengthening a little bit here and there, it's going to go, okay, that's outside of norm for me. I'm going to back off. So it will assume that there is resource contention somewhere in the environment. It could be at the host, it could be the network, it could be the storage. It doesn't matter. That lengthening I/O response time is its self-governing mechanism to say, let me back off. And that's why you can get away with deploying just to the VMs and never worry about any resource contention. Jason asks, regarding IntelliWrite, how does it affect the small SQL log writes when a hard crash like a power outage occurs? So Howard, I'll turn that over to you.
Well, from an IntelliWrite point of view, we're just providing the intelligence or the information that Windows needs to handle the write. We're not involved in actually writing the data. Windows and NTFS is still handling and processing that write request. So there's no negative effect of us being in play there. And so your writes are going to occur just as they normally would without us.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Vince asks, does this affect volume if REFS, or does it need to be NTFS? And Howard, I believe it does need to be NTFS, correct?
It does need to be NTFS, although we have our ears close to the ground listening to what people are saying. It's just really a matter of how many people out there truly are using REFS for their production type storage environment. And as we start seeing more and more people using that, naturally it's something that we'll take into consideration in future releases.
Great. Thank you, Howard. Karen circled back around and mentioned that, Carol mentioned, she asked an earlier question about running DiskKeeper versus Velocity, and she just clarified she's running DiskKeeper 18. So Carol, you've got the latest. You've got all of the technology in Velocity that we've talked about today is in DiskKeeper 18, and you could feel free to continue with DiskKeeper 18 and expand that to your other VMs or physical servers, or we could convert that one license of DiskKeeper at no charge for you over to the Velocity if you wanted to move over to the other product. Really, the choice is yours. I do just like that single pane of glass experience, so you're only managing one UI. The products do the same thing, but they are managed differently with different consoles, and they have different UIs, even though the same engines are in them. Lou said, I may have missed a slide. Is there still a benefit in all-flash environments? And Lou, that's a really good question. And yes, there is absolutely a benefit in all-flash environments. Flash is just really fast. But it can still get swamped by the noisy, tiny, repetitive I/O coming down from all of these Windows VMs, and the I/O blender effect and the Windows I/O tax compound to drag it down. Then there's a good analogy that I gave where we had that customer that had the 11 physical servers attached to an all-flash 600,000 IOPS pure storage, and the reason even with that much capacity in all-flash, the reason that we still had a material benefit is because we needed to optimize the 10% or 2% of their IOPS capacity that they were using was not being used efficiently because of the Windows I/O tax and the I/O blender effect. So if we're able to streamline the I/O or the percentage of the I/O that is being used, we can still realize a 30 to 40% throughput improvement even on all-flash, even HCI environments. It is still a very material and significant benefit. And a number of our case studies on our website are highlighted with all-flash. One example would be like the University of Illinois case study that I did mention, where they were on an all-flash Dell Compellent fan. Day one, they were great, but then that slow creep of degradation, kind of that turning the radio volume up, not realizing how loud it got. Same thing with performance, not realizing how bad it got. And then you all of a sudden hop in the car and it blasts you out the next time you get in the car. Same thing with this. You can install Velocity in that level 1, level 2, or level 3 approach. Just target the main VM. If that doesn't get you there, get all the VMs on the host and or all the VMs supporting that application. And then if that doesn't get you there, then all the VMs on the SAN. And it does make a really big difference. Vince, how would you deploy in an always-on cluster? Howard, I'll flip that one over to you.
Well, simple enough that you would install on each individual virtual machine in that clustered environment and just let it go. It works just fine, and will automatically detect whether it's active-active or active-passive, and apply the appropriate technologies for that environment.
Okay, so I've got the last question here. And do installs require a server reboot? And no, they do not. Yes. We used to require reboots, but with our hooray, with our new versions that we've released, they do not require reboot. So we are going to go for an on-time landing, as the airline industry might say, and stop here at the top of the hour. Really, really appreciate all of the dynamic questions that came over. We will be sure to send out today all of your NFR, your free copies of the individual standalone, and then we'll also go through and make sure that everyone who dropped IO assessment tool or VMC or all of the above into that box, we will definitely get those out to you. And so, Dan, you've written NFR. You're going to be getting the NFR, and everyone on the call is getting the NFR for sure. But if you want that extra Velocity trialware with the Velocity Management Console and the IOAT, keep dropping those comments in. And again, thank you very much. And Howard, I also just wanted to thank you for your time today and your expertise and sharing your knowledge with us as well.
Well, thanks very much, Jennifer. It's always my pleasure. And to everybody out there, have a wonderful holiday. And thank you very much for attending.